On a rainy autumn evening, Mark Mercer arrived at the old Central Station with a worn leather suitcase and a ticket for the Night Star Express, a train that would travel across the country until dawn. The station was alive with distant announcements, rolling luggage, and the soft murmur of travelers beginning their journeys. Mark had not planned this trip for long. 3 days earlier, he had received a letter from an elderly aunt he barely remembered. The letter contained only a short message asking him to visit the coastal town of Silver Bay as soon as possible. No explanation was given. Curious and slightly uneasy, he had decided to go. As the large black locomotive pulled into the station, steam drifted through the cold air and wrapped around the platform lights like pale ghosts. Mark boarded carriage 7 and found compartment 16. Inside were 4 seats facing each other and a large window covered with tiny droplets of rain. The compartment was empty except for a woman in her 30s who was reading a thick novel. She looked up briefly, smiled politely, and returned to her book. Mark placed his suitcase on the rack and sat down across from her. Moments later, the train whistle echoed through the station. The doors closed. With a gentle movement, the train began to roll forward. The city lights slowly drifted away behind them. For a while, neither passenger spoke. Mark watched reflections slide across the dark glass while fields and distant roads disappeared into the night. Eventually, the woman closed her book and introduced herself as Susan Hart. She was traveling to a mountain village where her younger brother lived. Her calm voice and friendly manner made conversation easy. Soon they were discussing books, favorite cities, and unusual travel experiences. The hours passed comfortably. At the next station, an elderly man entered the compartment. He wore a dark blue coat and carried a polished wooden cane. After greeting them warmly, he introduced himself as Arthur Bennett. He seemed cheerful and curious about everyone he met. Not long afterward, the train attendant arrived to check tickets and offer refreshments. The atmosphere felt peaceful and ordinary. Yet as midnight approached, Mark noticed something strange. Every passenger in the carriage appeared on the digital passenger list displayed near the corridor except one. While walking toward the dining car, he had glanced at the screen and seen dozens of names. But there had also been an empty line between 2 entries. No name. No seat number. Just a blank space. Assuming it was a technical error, he ignored it. Later, while returning to his compartment, he passed a closed door at the end of the carriage. A small brass plate beside it displayed the number 17. Mark frowned. He clearly remembered that compartment 16 was the last listed cabin in this section. Curious, he paused and looked again. The number remained there. Before he could investigate further, the train suddenly entered a tunnel. Darkness swallowed the windows. The lights flickered once. Then twice. When they stabilized, Mark noticed something unexpected. The door marked 17 was gone. Only a smooth wall remained, as if the compartment had never existed at all. He stood motionless in the corridor while the train rushed through the darkness, uncertain whether he had seen something impossible or whether the long day had finally begun to play tricks on his tired mind. Mark remained standing in the corridor for several seconds after the train emerged from the tunnel. Moonlight returned to the windows and silver reflections moved across the polished walls of the carriage. He looked again at the place where compartment 17 had supposedly been. There was nothing unusual to see. The wall stretched uninterrupted between two luggage cabinets exactly as if no door had ever existed there. Feeling slightly embarrassed by his own confusion, he returned to compartment 16. Susan was reading once more while Arthur sat quietly beside the window observing the passing landscape. Mark considered mentioning what he had seen but decided against it. The story sounded ridiculous even to him. Instead, he sat down and accepted a cup of tea offered by the train attendant. The warm drink helped him relax. Soon the conversation turned toward travel memories. Arthur described a train journey he had taken many years earlier through snow-covered valleys in the north. Susan shared a story about becoming lost in a small foreign town and discovering a wonderful cafe she would never have found otherwise. As they spoke, Mark noticed how comfortable the compartment felt despite the late hour. The steady rhythm of wheels against rails created a soothing background that encouraged reflection. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, Arthur excused himself and went to the dining car. Susan soon closed her novel and fell asleep with her head resting gently against the seat. Mark remained awake. Sleep refused to come. He found himself thinking about his aunt's mysterious letter. Why had she contacted him after so many years? Why had she asked him to come immediately? The questions lingered in his mind without answers. Eventually he decided to stretch his legs. The corridor was nearly empty. Most passengers had retired to their compartments. Soft yellow lights illuminated the carriage while distant mechanical sounds echoed from somewhere deep within the train. Mark walked slowly toward the dining car. As he passed the digital passenger display again, he stopped. The blank entry was still there. This time he examined it carefully. Above and below the empty line were ordinary names and seat numbers. Yet the space between them remained completely vacant. No text. No symbol. Nothing. It looked less like missing information and more like information deliberately removed. A faint feeling of curiosity returned. Continuing onward, he reached the dining car and found Arthur seated alone with a cup of coffee. The old man smiled and invited him to join him. Their conversation soon drifted toward unusual experiences. Arthur spoke thoughtfully about coincidence and memory. He believed that people often notice strange things during long journeys because travel temporarily separated them from familiar routines. Mark almost mentioned the mysterious door and blank passenger entry but hesitated. Instead, he listened. Arthur possessed a gentle wisdom that made even ordinary observations seem meaningful. After half an hour, Mark returned toward his compartment. Near the end of the carriage he noticed a young conductor studying a clipboard. Hoping to satisfy his curiosity, he politely asked whether there had ever been a compartment 17 in carriage 7. The conductor looked surprised. He shook his head immediately. According to the carriage layout, compartment 16 was and always had been the final compartment. Mark thanked him and continued walking. Yet before he left, the conductor added something unusual. Earlier that evening, another passenger had asked the exact same question. Mark turned quickly. "Who was it?" he asked. The conductor frowned as if trying to remember. "That is the strange part," he replied. "I cannot seem to recall." The answer stayed with Mark as he returned to his seat. Susan remained asleep. Arthur had not yet come back. Outside, the countryside rolled silently beneath the moon. Mark glanced through the window and noticed a distant light standing alone on a hill. It appeared for only a moment before vanishing behind a curve in the track. Then he saw something reflected in the glass behind him. For the briefest instant, another passenger seemed to be sitting in the empty seat beside Susan. A shadowy figure. Calm and motionless. Mark spun around immediately. The seat was empty. Yet his heart was beating faster now. The night train continued onward through the darkness, carrying its passengers toward destinations known and unknown, while the mystery surrounding the invisible traveler seemed only to deepen. Mark sat quietly for several minutes, trying to convince himself that fatigue was responsible for everything he had witnessed. The disappearing door, the blank passenger entry, the conductor's strange answer, and now the reflection of a passenger who was not there. Each event could perhaps be explained individually, yet together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. Outside the window, the countryside had become a landscape of dark forests and occasional distant farmhouses glowing beneath the moonlight. The train moved steadily through the sleeping world. Eventually Arthur returned from the dining car carrying a newspaper he had found in a rack near the lounge compartment. He seemed cheerful as ever and settled comfortably into his seat. Susan remained asleep. Her novel rested on her lap, its pages slightly open. Mark considered sharing his concerns but hesitated again. Instead, he asked Arthur whether he had ever experienced anything unusual during train journeys. The old man smiled thoughtfully. "Many unusual things," he replied. "Though not all of them are mysterious. Sometimes the strangest experiences come from meeting people at the right moment." Mark nodded politely. Arthur unfolded the newspaper and began reading. A few moments later, however, his expression changed. He stared at one page longer than expected. Then he folded the newspaper carefully and placed it beside him. "Something interesting?" Mark asked. Arthur hesitated. "Perhaps," he said. "Or perhaps only a coincidence." Before Mark could ask more, the train attendant entered the compartment to collect empty cups and offer fresh drinks. The moment passed. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, Susan woke and stretched slightly. After apologizing for falling asleep, she joined the conversation. The three travelers spoke quietly while the train continued through the night. There was something comforting about sharing a compartment with strangers who gradually felt less like strangers. Mark found himself relaxing again. Maybe he truly had imagined everything. Maybe the night itself encouraged such thoughts. Some time later, Susan excused herself and went to the lounge area in search of coffee. Arthur soon followed, saying he wanted another look at the newspaper. Mark remained alone. Silence filled the compartment. The wheels beneath the carriage created a steady rhythm that almost resembled distant music. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he noticed something on the seat opposite him. A small envelope rested there. He was certain it had not been present earlier. Curious, he picked it up. No name appeared on the front. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper. On it, written in neat handwriting, was a short sentence. Some passengers arrive before their journey begins. Mark read the words twice. They made no sense. He examined the paper carefully, searching for additional clues, but there was nothing else. No signature. No date. No explanation. A cold sensation moved through him. Just then, footsteps approached. He quickly slipped the paper back into the envelope as Susan returned carrying coffee. Arthur followed a minute later. Neither seemed aware of the mysterious note. Mark decided not to mention it yet. Instead, he placed the envelope inside his jacket pocket. Conversation resumed, but his attention kept drifting toward the strange message. As the hours passed, the train approached one of its scheduled overnight stops. The station was small and nearly deserted. Only a handful of passengers boarded while others stepped off onto the dimly lit platform. Mark watched through the window. Among the travelers, he noticed a tall man wearing a gray coat and a dark hat. There was nothing remarkable about him at first glance. Yet something felt familiar. After a moment, Mark realized why. The man resembled the figure he thought he had seen reflected in the window earlier. The resemblance was not exact, but it was enough to unsettle him. The man boarded the train and disappeared into another carriage. Minutes later, the train departed once more. As the station lights faded behind them, Mark casually asked the attendant whether new passengers had entered carriage 7. The attendant checked a small electronic device and shook her head. "No," she replied. "No one boarded this carriage at the last stop." Mark looked back toward the corridor. The answer should have reassured him. Instead, it raised another question. If no passenger had entered carriage 7, then where had the man in the gray coat gone? Far ahead, the train vanished into another tunnel, and for the first time that night Mark felt certain that somewhere aboard the Night Star Express, a secret was waiting to be discovered. The tunnel seemed longer than the previous ones. Darkness pressed against every window while the carriage lights reflected softly from polished surfaces. The passengers in carriage 7 continued their conversations, read their books, or rested quietly, yet Mark could not shake the feeling that something was changing around him. His hand occasionally touched the envelope inside his jacket pocket, as though confirming it was still there. The mysterious sentence remained fixed in his thoughts. Some passengers arrive before their journey begins. The words felt less like a message and more like a clue. When the train finally emerged from the tunnel, the landscape outside had transformed. Mist covered the valleys and low hills beyond the tracks. Under the moonlight, the world appeared almost dreamlike. Arthur noticed Mark staring out the window and asked whether something was troubling him. For the first time, Mark decided to share part of what he had experienced. He mentioned the blank passenger entry on the digital display and the compartment numbered 17 that had apparently vanished. He deliberately said nothing about the envelope. Susan listened with interest while Arthur remained thoughtful. Neither laughed at him. Instead, Susan admitted that she had noticed something unusual herself. Earlier in the evening, while looking for the restroom, she had become briefly disoriented and found herself standing in a corridor she did not remember passing through. The corridor had seemed slightly different from the rest of the train. The lighting was softer. The carpet pattern was unfamiliar. Yet when she turned around and retraced her steps, she could not find it again. Arthur nodded slowly. "Interesting," he said. Perhaps we are all becoming victims of a long night and active imaginations. His smile suggested he was not entirely convinced by his own explanation. A short while later, curiosity overcame Mark. He removed the envelope and showed the note to his companions. Susan read it twice and frowned. Arthur studied it carefully before returning it. "The handwriting is elegant," he observed. "Old-fashioned, perhaps. But I do not recognize it." They discussed possible explanations. A practical joke seemed unlikely. None of them knew anyone else aboard the train. The attendant had not entered the compartment during the period when the envelope appeared. The mystery remained unsolved. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the train became quieter still. Most passengers were asleep. Even the distant sounds from neighboring carriages seemed subdued. Mark decided to investigate further. This time Susan and Arthur agreed to accompany him. Together they left the compartment and walked through carriage 7. The digital passenger display still showed the unexplained blank line. Susan touched the screen lightly, expecting perhaps a technical malfunction. But nothing changed. Arthur carefully counted the listed compartments. The numbering ended at 16 exactly as expected. Yet the empty entry remained present between two passenger names. The three travelers exchanged uncertain glances. Continuing toward the end of the carriage, they reached the section where Mark had previously seen compartment 17. Again there was only an ordinary wall. However, as they stood there, Arthur suddenly noticed something. Embedded near the floor was a small brass plate partially hidden behind a luggage cabinet. Time had darkened its surface. Susan knelt and brushed away a layer of dust. Faint engraved numbers became visible. The plate read simply, 17. For several seconds no one spoke. The existence of the plate did not explain the missing compartment, but it confirmed that the number had once been associated with this part of the carriage. Arthur examined the wall closely. There were no handles, hinges, or visible seams. Yet the discovery made Mark feel unexpectedly relieved. At least he now knew he had not imagined everything. Before they could investigate further, a voice spoke behind them. "Looking for something?" The three turned. A man in a gray coat stood several meters away in the corridor. Mark immediately recognized him as the passenger he had seen boarding at the previous station. The man appeared calm and friendly. His dark hat rested beneath one arm. His expression suggested simple curiosity rather than suspicion. Arthur politely explained that they had become interested in the history of the carriage. The stranger smiled. "History often leaves traces in unexpected places," he replied. "Especially on trains." There was something unusual about his voice. Not frightening. Not threatening. Merely familiar, as though Mark had heard it before without realizing where. The stranger wished them a pleasant evening and continued down the corridor. Mark watched him disappear around a corner. Moments later, he followed, intending to ask another question. Yet when he reached the intersection between carriages, the corridor was empty. There were no nearby doors. No side passages. No sign of the gray-coated passenger. It was as though he had stepped out of sight and vanished. Returning slowly to his companions, Mark felt the mystery tightening around them. The train raced onward through the sleeping countryside while dawn remained hours away, and somewhere among its carriages seemed to exist a hidden story that connected the missing compartment, the blank passenger entry, the anonymous note, and the stranger who appeared wherever questions began to lead. After returning to compartment 16, none of the three travelers felt particularly eager to sleep. The discoveries of the evening had transformed what should have been an ordinary journey into something far more intriguing. Susan sat beside the window with a cup of tea. Arthur carefully folded the newspaper he had been carrying all night and placed it on the table between them. Mark remained thoughtful, replaying every strange event in his mind. The brass plate marked 17 had provided the first piece of physical evidence that something unusual existed within carriage 7. Yet instead of answering questions, it had only created new ones. Outside, the mist had thickened across the countryside. Trees appeared and disappeared like shadows beyond the glass. The train maintained its steady pace toward the distant coast. Eventually Arthur tapped the folded newspaper. "There is something I did not mention earlier," he said. Mark and Susan looked at him expectantly. Arthur opened the paper to a page containing a feature article about railway history. The article described famous train routes, retired locomotives, and stories collected from long-distance travelers over many decades. One section focused on the Night Star Express itself. According to the article, many years ago an older version of the train had included an additional compartment in carriage 7. The compartment had been designated number 17. During a major renovation nearly 20 years earlier, the carriage layout had been redesigned and the compartment had supposedly been removed to create extra storage space. Susan immediately remembered the brass plate. Mark felt a small rush of excitement. At last they had found a logical explanation for part of the mystery. Yet one detail remained troubling. If compartment 17 had truly been removed decades ago, why had Mark seen an actual door only a few hours earlier? Arthur seemed to be considering the same question. He turned the page and continued reading. Near the end of the article appeared a brief anecdote contributed by a retired conductor. The story mentioned occasional reports from passengers who claimed to have become lost while walking through carriage 7 late at night. Most accounts described unusual corridors, unexpected doors, or compartments that could not later be found. The railway company dismissed the stories as harmless travel legends. Nevertheless, the article included them because they had persisted for generations. Susan laughed softly. "So our train has its own folklore." Arthur nodded. "Every old railway seems to collect such stories." Despite the reasonable explanation, Mark remained uneasy. The envelope in his pocket still had no origin. Nor did the blank entry on the passenger display. Their discussion continued until a faint announcement sounded through the carriage speakers. The train would soon pass through Raven Crossing, an isolated stretch of track known for dramatic views at sunrise. Most passengers remained asleep, but Mark noticed several people quietly gathering near the observation lounge. Curious, the three companions decided to visit. The lounge occupied the rear section of the train and featured large panoramic windows. When they arrived, only a handful of travelers were present. Some sipped coffee while others watched the landscape. The atmosphere felt peaceful. Mark found himself relaxing again. Perhaps the mystery would eventually prove less extraordinary than it seemed. Then he noticed someone seated alone near the far window. The man in the gray coat. This time there was no possibility of mistake. He sat calmly with a notebook resting on his lap. Susan recognized him as well. Arthur offered a polite greeting as they approached. The stranger smiled warmly and invited them to sit. Up close, he appeared to be in his late 40s. His features were ordinary yet strangely memorable. Conversation began naturally. He introduced himself simply as Victor. When asked where he was traveling, however, he gave an unusual answer. "I suppose I am still deciding," he said with a gentle smile. Susan assumed he was joking. Arthur chuckled politely. Yet Mark noticed that Victor never actually named a destination. Instead, he asked questions about their own journeys. His interest seemed genuine. Mark mentioned Silver Bay and the letter from his aunt. Victor listened carefully. "Sometimes a journey begins long before a ticket is purchased," he said. The remark immediately reminded Mark of the mysterious note. Before he could respond, the train entered a wide curve. Golden hints of approaching dawn appeared along the distant horizon. Passengers moved closer to the windows to admire the view. For a few minutes everyone focused on the landscape. Then Mark turned back toward Victor. The seat was empty. Startled, he looked around the lounge. There was only one exit. No one had passed through it. Susan searched the room as well. Arthur rose slowly and checked nearby sections of the carriage. Victor was nowhere to be found. The disappearance was so complete that several passengers seemed uncertain whether anyone had been sitting there at all. On the small table beside the abandoned seat, however, rested a single object. It was a folded page torn from a notebook. Mark picked it up carefully. Written in the same elegant handwriting as the note inside his pocket were 6 simple words. The answer waits where 17 ended. The 3 companions stared at the message while the first pale light of dawn began to spread across the horizon, and for the first time they felt they were no longer merely observing a mystery but actively being guided toward its solution. The new message changed the mood completely. Until now, the strange events aboard the Night Star Express had felt like disconnected puzzles, curious but harmless. The note left in the observation lounge suggested something different. Someone seemed to know exactly what Mark and his companions were investigating. More importantly, that person appeared determined to lead them somewhere. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern horizon, the 3 travelers returned to carriage 7 carrying the folded page. Most passengers were still asleep. The train moved through rolling hills now touched by pale shades of gold and silver. Mark read the message repeatedly. The answer waits where 17 ended. Susan believed the clue referred to the location where compartment 17 had once existed. Arthur agreed. The wording seemed too deliberate to mean anything else. After a brief discussion, they returned to the end of the carriage where the brass plate had been discovered. Morning light now filtered through the windows, making the corridor appear far less mysterious than it had during the night. Yet the strange sense of anticipation remained. Arthur examined the wall again. Susan inspected the luggage cabinets. Mark studied the floor. At first, nothing unusual appeared. Then he noticed a slight difference in the carpet near the hidden brass plate. The pattern was nearly identical to the surrounding material. But a narrow rectangular section seemed newer than the rest. Kneeling carefully, he ran his fingers along its edge. Beneath the fabric he felt something solid and metallic. Susan helped lift the corner slightly. Hidden underneath was a small recessed handle. The three exchanged surprised glances. Arthur gently pulled the handle upward. A narrow panel in the floor opened with a soft click. Inside rested a flat metal box no larger than a briefcase. Dust covered its surface. It looked as though it had remained untouched for many years. Mark carefully lifted it out. There was no lock. When he opened the lid, they found several items neatly arranged inside. The first was a collection of old photographs. Most showed passengers aboard trains from different decades. Some smiled beside compartment doors. Others stood on station platforms. One photograph immediately caught Mark's attention. It depicted Carriage 7 many years earlier. Clearly visible in the image was a door marked 17. The compartment had indeed existed. Beneath the photographs lay a leather journal. Its pages had yellowed with age but remained in excellent condition. Arthur opened it carefully. The journal belonged to a railway employee named Samuel Whitmore. According to the first entries, Samuel had served as a conductor on the Night Star Express nearly 30 years earlier. As they read further, an extraordinary story began to emerge. Samuel described meeting countless passengers during his years of service. Most were quickly forgotten. A few became memorable. Yet one group stood apart from all others. Over several years, Samuel repeatedly encountered travelers who claimed to have experienced strange occurrences near compartment 17. Some reported hearing conversations from an empty room. Others described meeting fellow passengers who later appeared to have vanished. Samuel himself remained skeptical at first. Gradually, however, he began documenting the reports. His journal contained detailed notes, dates, and observations. Surprisingly, none involved danger or fear. Instead, the experiences often carried a sense of reflection or unfinished connection. Many passengers claimed they had encountered people who helped them understand an important decision, remember a forgotten promise, or view their lives from a new perspective. Susan found the accounts fascinating. Arthur appeared deeply thoughtful. Mark continued reading until he reached the final pages. There the tone changed. Samuel wrote about the planned renovation that would remove compartment 17 permanently. He feared the compartment's unusual history would disappear along with it. As a result, he created the hidden box and placed inside it selected photographs, notes, and a final letter intended for anyone curious enough to search for answers in the future. Mark unfolded the letter. The handwriting matched both mysterious notes perfectly. The revelation stunned him. Samuel Whitmore had written the messages decades earlier. Yet that seemed impossible. The notes they had received during the journey were clearly recent. Arthur read the letter aloud. Samuel explained that every journey contained moments when travelers stood between one chapter of life and the next. He believed compartment 17 had become associated with such moments. Whether through coincidence, imagination, or something more mysterious, passengers often found there exactly the conversation or insight they needed. The final sentence captured everyone's attention. If you discover this box, remember that some journeys are not measured by distance but by understanding. Silence filled the corridor after Arthur finished reading. The morning sun now illuminated the carriage completely. The mystery appeared partially solved. The hidden compartment had existed. The journal explained the legends. Yet one question remained unanswered. Who was Victor? The man in the gray coat had known details contained within a journal hidden for decades. As if responding to Mark's thoughts, a voice spoke gently from behind them. An excellent question. The three companions turned immediately. Standing at the far end of the corridor was Victor. He smiled warmly, sunlight shining through the nearby window. This time, however, he did not seem ready to disappear. Instead, he took a few calm steps forward and looked directly at the journal resting in Arthur's hands, as though he had been waiting many years for someone to finally open it. For a moment, none of them spoke. Victor stood calmly in the corridor while the train continued its journey toward the coast. The morning sun illuminated the carriage, removing the shadows that had accompanied the mystery throughout the night. Yet despite the daylight, Victor seemed no less unusual. Mark was the first to break the silence. He asked how Victor knew about the hidden box and the journal. The man smiled, though not in a secretive way. Instead, his expression carried a sense of quiet satisfaction, as if a long-awaited event had finally occurred. Because I have been searching for it for many years, he replied. Arthur studied him carefully. You knew Samuel Whitmore? Victor nodded. Only briefly. I was very young at the time. He glanced toward the photographs inside the box. My grandfather worked on the railway. Samuel was one of his closest friends. The explanation immediately made Victor seem more ordinary, yet it did not answer every question. Susan pointed out that the notes they had received during the journey appeared to have been written recently. Victor acknowledged this with another smile. They were. Mark frowned. Then you left them? Yes, Victor answered. I hoped someone would be curious enough to follow the clues. The admission surprised none of them as much as it perhaps should have. In truth, they had already suspected his involvement. Yet the revelation brought relief. At least one part of the mystery now possessed a clear explanation. Victor joined them beside the window and began telling his story. Years earlier, his grandfather had spoken often about Samuel Whitmore and the strange legends surrounding Compartment 17. Before his death, the old railway worker had mentioned a hidden collection of notes and photographs somewhere aboard Carriage 7. Unfortunately, he had never revealed the exact location. Victor had spent years trying to uncover the truth. Occasionally he traveled on the Night Star Express, searching for clues. He had discovered references to the hidden journal but never found the box itself. Until last night, Arthur said. Victor nodded. You noticed things that many passengers would ignore. Mark thought about the disappearing door, the brass plate, and the blank passenger entry. Not all of those things can be explained by your clues, he observed. Victor seemed unsurprised. Perhaps not. The answer hung in the air. Susan asked about the blank line on the digital passenger display. Victor admitted he knew nothing about it. Arthur mentioned the conductor who could not remember another passenger asking about compartment 17. Victor laughed softly and said he had indeed spoken to the conductor earlier. Though I suppose I made little impression. The explanation sounded reasonable enough. Still, Mark felt that certain pieces remained unresolved. They returned to the compartment carrying the journal and photographs. Over the next hour they examined everything carefully. Several photographs contained handwritten notes on the back. Many described ordinary journeys that later became important turning points in people's lives. One passenger had met a future business partner aboard the train. Another had decided to reconcile with an estranged family member after a conversation during a long overnight trip. The stories were simple but meaningful. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Compartment 17 had become famous not because of supernatural events but because it encouraged reflection. Travelers passing through periods of uncertainty often attached special significance to experiences they had there. Samuel Whitmore had simply preserved those stories. As the train moved closer to Silver Bay, the landscape outside changed dramatically. Forests gave way to cliffs overlooking the sea. Bright sunlight sparkled on distant waves. The atmosphere aboard the train grew livelier as passengers awoke and prepared for arrival. Yet Mark found himself thinking less about the mystery and more about the reason for his own journey. He still knew almost nothing about the letter from his aunt. Victor seemed to notice his mood. "You are wondering what awaits you," he said. Mark admitted that he was. Victor looked out the window for several moments before speaking again. Most people board trains hoping to reach a destination. Sometimes the destination is only an excuse to begin asking the questions they have avoided. The statement sounded similar to the observations found in Samuel's journal. Yet coming from Victor, it felt personal. Before Mark could respond, the public address system announced that Silver Bay would be reached in approximately 40 minutes. Passengers began collecting luggage. Susan would continue farther inland after a short transfer. Arthur planned to leave the train 2 stations later. The realization that their shared journey was nearing its end filled the compartment with unexpected melancholy. What had begun as an ordinary overnight trip had become something none of them would forget. As Mark gathered the photographs and journal, a folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages and landed on the floor. He picked it up. Unlike the earlier notes, this one appeared much older. The paper had yellowed with age. On it, in Samuel Whitmore's handwriting, was a short list of names. Most meant nothing to Mark. Then he reached the final entry and froze. Written clearly at the bottom of the page was a name he recognized immediately. It was his aunt's name. Eleanor Mercer. Mark stared at the paper in disbelief while the train sped toward Silver Bay. Somehow, decades before sending the letter that had brought him aboard the Night Star Express, his aunt had become connected to the story of Compartment 17. And suddenly the mystery seemed far from over. The discovery of Eleanor Mercer's name transformed everything. Mark read the list repeatedly, hoping he had misunderstood. Yet the name remained there, written clearly in faded ink among several others. Arthur adjusted his glasses and examined the page himself. Susan leaned closer. Victor's expression grew thoughtful the moment he saw it. Unlike the rest of them, he did not appear entirely surprised. Mark immediately noticed. "You knew about this," he said. Victor shook his head. "Not exactly. But I knew Samuel occasionally mentioned a woman named Eleanor in his journal. I never knew her surname." Mark felt a mixture of excitement and confusion. His aunt had always been a distant figure in family conversations. He remembered meeting her only once as a child. She had seemed kind but quiet, someone who preferred listening rather than speaking. After that visit, years had passed without contact. Then came the letter that had suddenly drawn him to Silver Bay. Now her name appeared inside a decades-old railway journal connected to the mystery that had occupied their entire journey. The coincidence seemed impossible. Arthur carefully searched the journal again. After several minutes, he located a passage containing Eleanor's name. The entry had been written 24 years earlier. Samuel described meeting a young woman traveling alone to Silver Bay after receiving unexpected news about a relative. According to the journal, she spent much of the journey sitting in compartment 17. Samuel noted that she appeared worried when she boarded but remarkably calm when she departed. He never explained why. More intriguingly, he added a final observation. Miss Mercer believes some journeys reveal answers only after many years have passed. Mark read the sentence several times. It sounded exactly like something his aunt might say. Susan smiled gently. "Perhaps she left you the letter because she wanted you to discover this." Mark considered the possibility. If Eleanor knew about Samuel, the journal, and compartment 17, then perhaps his arrival on this train had not been accidental at all. Perhaps she had expected him to uncover the hidden box. Yet that raised another question. How could she possibly have known the journal would still be there after so many years? The train continued along the coastline. Brilliant sunlight filled the compartment. Below the cliffs, waves rolled against the shore in long white lines. Despite the beauty outside, everyone remained focused on the mystery. Victor eventually spoke. "There may be one way to find out." He pointed toward the final pages of the journal. Tucked inside the back cover was a folded railway timetable from decades earlier. On its reverse side Samuel had drawn a small map of Silver Bay. Several locations were marked. Most referred to ordinary places such as the station, the harbor, and a local cafe. One location, however, was circled several times in dark ink. Beside it Samuel had written only 2 words. Meeting place. Mark studied the map carefully. The marked location overlooked the sea on the eastern side of town. Victor believed Samuel, Eleanor, and perhaps others connected to compartment 17 had gathered there occasionally. Whether the site still existed was impossible to know. Before they could discuss it further, the train slowed noticeably. An announcement informed passengers that Silver Bay was now less than 15 minutes away. Activity filled the carriage. Suitcases emerged from racks. Conversations resumed. The journey was approaching its conclusion. Susan packed her belongings and promised to stay in touch with Mark if he ever learned the full story. Arthur did the same. Though they had known one another for only a single night, the experience had created an unexpected friendship. Victor remained unusually quiet. Mark eventually asked whether he intended to leave the train at Silver Bay as well. The man smiled. "No. My destination lies farther ahead. It was the first time he had ever mentioned a destination at all. The answer somehow felt significant. As the coastline curved toward the harbor, Silver Bay finally appeared in the distance. White buildings climbed gentle hills overlooking the water. Fishing boats rested in the marina. The town looked peaceful and welcoming beneath the morning sun. Mark felt a growing anticipation. Soon he would see his aunt for the first time in years. Soon he might finally learn why she had sent the letter. The train entered the outskirts of town. Passengers moved toward the exits. Then, just before arrival, Victor reached into his coat pocket and handed Mark a small brass key. The metal appeared old and slightly worn. "I found this years ago among my grandfather's belongings," he explained. "I believe it belonged to Samuel." Mark examined the key. A tiny number had been engraved near its base. The number was 17. "What does it open?" Mark asked. Victor shook his head. "I never discovered that." The train whistle sounded. Silver Bay Station came into view beyond the windows. Mark looked up for only a second. When he turned back, Victor was standing and preparing to leave the compartment. He offered a handshake first to Arthur, then Susan, and finally Mark. "Whatever answers await you," he said, "I hope they are worth the journey." Moments later, the train rolled into the station. Passengers began stepping onto the platform. Mark collected his suitcase, the journal, the photographs, and the brass key. As he joined the crowd moving toward the door, he glanced back one final time. Victor was no longer visible. Yet unlike before, Mark did not search for him. Instead, he stepped onto the platform at Silver Bay carrying more questions than when he had boarded the Night Star Express, but also carrying the sense that the final answers were now very close indeed. The sea air greeted Mark the moment he stepped onto the platform. After the confined warmth of the train, the fresh coastal breeze felt invigorating. Silver Bay Station was smaller than he had imagined. The building possessed an old-fashioned charm, with stone walls, flower boxes beneath the windows, and a clock tower that overlooked both the tracks and the harbor beyond. Around him, passengers reunited with relatives, searched for taxis, or continued toward connecting services. Susan departed with a final wave before heading toward another platform. Arthur wished Mark good luck and disappeared into the crowd. Within minutes, the companions who had shared the long night journey were gone. Only Mark remained, carrying Samuel Whitmore's journal, the photographs, and the brass key marked 17. Near the station entrance stood a woman with silver hair and a navy blue coat. Though many years had passed since Mark had last seen her, he recognized her immediately. Eleanor Mercer looked older than he remembered, yet her eyes possessed the same calm warmth. When she saw him, a gentle smile appeared on her face. Mark crossed the platform and embraced her. For a moment neither spoke. The reunion felt strangely emotional despite the years of distance between them. Eventually Eleanor stepped back and looked at the items in his hands. Her gaze settled on the journal. Something resembling relief passed across her face. "You found it," she said quietly. Mark stared at her. "You knew about the journal?" Eleanor nodded. "And the hidden box?" Another nod. "The train. Compartment 17. Samuel Whitmore. This time she smiled slightly. Yes, she replied. I knew about all of it. 100 questions immediately rushed into Mark's mind. Yet Eleanor gently suggested they leave the station first. They walked through the town together. Silver Bay proved every bit as beautiful as it had appeared from the train. Narrow streets wound between cafes, bookstores, and small shops. Seagulls drifted above the harbor. The sea glittered beneath the late morning sun. Eventually they reached Eleanor's cottage on a hill overlooking the bay. The house was modest but welcoming, surrounded by flowering plants and weathered stone walls. Once inside, Eleanor prepared tea while Mark placed the journal on the table. The moment they sat down, he asked the question that mattered most. Why did you send for me? Eleanor looked toward the window for a few seconds before answering. Because I knew my time to tell this story was running short. The words carried no sadness. They sounded simply factual. She opened the journal and carefully turned its pages. When I was younger, I took a journey on the Night Star Express, she began. I had just received difficult news about my family. I felt lost and uncertain about the future. During that journey I met Samuel Whitmore. Mark listened intently. According to Eleanor, Samuel had been more than a conductor. He had become a patient listener. Over several hours, they discussed family, choices, regrets, and hopes. The conversation had taken place inside Compartment 17. By the time the train reached Silver Bay, she felt different. Not because Samuel had solved her problems, but because he had helped her view them differently. He believed journeys changed people, Eleanor said. Not through magic. Through perspective. Mark remembered the stories recorded in the journal. Many carried the same theme. Eleanor continued. Years later, Samuel wrote to me. We remained friends. When the railway decided to remove Compartment 17, he worried that the stories connected to it would disappear. So he preserved them. She gently touched the journal cover. Not because the compartment was special. Because the people were. The explanation felt surprisingly satisfying. The mystery that had seemed supernatural throughout the night increasingly appeared rooted in memory, coincidence, and human connection. Yet one important question remained. What about Victor? Mark asked. For the first time, Eleanor appeared genuinely surprised. Victor? Mark described the man in the gray coat. He explained how Victor had guided them toward the hidden box and eventually given him the brass key. Eleanor listened carefully. When he finished, she remained silent for several moments. Finally she stood and walked toward a bookshelf. From an old wooden box she removed a faded photograph and handed it to him. Mark looked down. The photograph showed Samuel Whitmore standing beside several railway employees decades earlier. Among them stood a younger man. A man wearing a gray coat. A man whose face was unmistakably Victor's. Mark slowly raised his eyes. Eleanor's expression revealed that she was just as confused as he was. There is only one problem, she said softly. What? She pointed to the photograph. That picture was taken 30 years ago. A silence settled over the room. Outside, waves rolled gently against the harbor below. Neither Mark nor Eleanor spoke. On the table between them rested the brass key marked 17. And for the first time since arriving in Silver Bay, Mark realized that the mystery might still contain one final chapter waiting to be uncovered. The afternoon sunlight slowly moved across the room while Mark continued staring at the photograph. The man beside Samuel Whitmore looked exactly like Victor. The same face. The same calm expression. Even the gray coat appeared nearly identical. Yet if the photograph had truly been taken 30 years earlier, the resemblance was impossible to explain. Eleanor sat quietly across from him. Neither attempted to force an answer. After the strange events aboard the Night Star Express, both had learned that not every mystery revealed itself immediately. Instead, Eleanor reached for the brass key and turned it gently in her fingers. "Perhaps," she said, "we should discover what this opens before worrying about anything else." Mark agreed. The key was, after all, the final clue Victor had left behind. Samuel's map still rested inside the journal. The location labeled Meeting Place overlooked the eastern side of Silver Bay. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Mark and Eleanor followed the map through winding streets and along a coastal path that climbed the cliffs beyond town. The sea stretched endlessly beneath them. Waves shimmered in the golden light. After nearly half an hour of walking, they reached a small stone pavilion overlooking the water. Time and weather had worn its surface smooth. It appeared abandoned, yet carefully maintained. At its center stood a wooden bench facing the horizon. For several moments nothing seemed unusual. Then Mark noticed a narrow metal compartment built into the base of the bench. A tiny keyhole was visible beneath a brass cover. Without speaking, he inserted the key marked 17. The lock turned easily. Inside the compartment rested a single sealed envelope. Eleanor smiled softly the moment she saw it. "Samuel," she whispered. Mark opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter written in the familiar elegant handwriting they had encountered throughout the journey. The paper had aged considerably, suggesting it had remained there for many years. Together they read the message. Samuel explained that he had created the pavilion cache shortly before retiring from the railway. The letter was intended for anyone who eventually followed the story of Compartment 17 to its conclusion. He wrote that many people searched for mysteries hoping to find extraordinary answers. Yet in his experience, the most meaningful discoveries were often simple. Trains carried strangers together for brief periods of time. During those journeys, people shared stories they might never tell elsewhere. They offered advice, kindness, understanding, and sometimes friendship. Compartment 17 had become famous not because it possessed special powers but because countless travelers had brought their hopes, fears, and turning points into that small room. The true mystery, Samuel wrote, was not the compartment itself. It was the way human lives unexpectedly touched one another. Near the end of the letter, Samuel addressed Eleanor directly. He thanked her for a conversation they had shared decades earlier and expressed hope that one day she would pass the story forward. The final paragraph seemed meant for Mark. "If you are reading this," Samuel wrote, "then your journey has already succeeded. Not because you found answers, but because you followed questions. Curiosity leads us toward people. People lead us toward understanding. And understanding is often the destination we were seeking all along." Mark lowered the letter. The sea breeze moved gently through the pavilion. Neither he nor Eleanor spoke for some time. The mystery that had begun aboard the Night Star Express suddenly felt complete. Some details remained unexplained. The blank passenger entry. The strange appearances of Victor. The remarkable photograph. Yet Mark found that he no longer needed perfect answers. The uncertainty itself had become part of the story. As the sun approached the horizon, Eleanor looked toward the sea. "Samuel would have liked you," she said. Mark smiled. "I think I would have liked him too." They remained at the pavilion until evening colors spread across the sky. When they finally returned to town, Mark carried the journal, the photographs, and Samuel's final letter. They no longer felt like clues. They felt like memories entrusted to him. Later that night, standing beside the window of Eleanor's cottage, Mark looked toward the railway line visible in the distance. A train moved across the darkening landscape, its lights shining softly beneath the stars. For a brief moment, he imagined he could see a familiar figure standing beside one of the windows, wearing a gray coat and watching the coastline pass by. Then the train disappeared into the night. Mark smiled rather than questioning what he had seen. Some mysteries were meant to be solved. Others were meant to be carried forward, becoming stories told to future travelers. And somewhere beyond the darkness, the Night Star Express continued its journey, carrying passengers toward new destinations, new beginnings, and perhaps, every now and then, another unforgettable encounter with the legend of the passenger on the night train.